Using Ethernet cables can greatly improve the performance of your home network, but only if you're using the right type of Ethernet cable. In a previous episode, I talked about the different categories of Ethernet cables that are available and which ones you should be using in your home network. Today, we're going to be talking about two different configurations that are available for each category of Ethernet cable. Specifically, we're talking about shielded and unshielded Ethernet cables. It's important to know which one to use in your home network because if you're using the wrong one, it can actually hinder the performance of the connections of your home network. So in this episode from Network from Home, we're going to be diving into the differences between shielded and unshielded Ethernet cables, and I'll also explain when you should use each one in your home network. Here in my hands, I have the two different types of Ethernet cables we're going to be talking about today. The tricky part is, just looking at the cables, it's really hard to tell which one's shielded and which one's unshielded. If you look really closely, you might be able to see that one Ethernet cable is slightly thicker than the other. That's a little bit of a telltale sign. Additionally, if you try to bend these cables, you can see this one bends pretty easily. This one does not bend nearly as easily, and that's a dead giveaway as well. Shielded Ethernet cables don't bend as well as unshielded cables, but to give you a very clear picture of the differences between these cables, I'm going to cut them both open so you can see what they look like on the inside. Okay, the first Ethernet cable we're going to look at is the unshielded Ethernet cable. Inside of this sheath here, what you can see is there are 8 copper wires and they are twisted together in 4 pairs of 2. We'll talk about why they're twisted together a little bit later here, but as you can see, there's not a whole lot going on here. You basically just have wires inside of this sheath here, and that's it for unshielded cables. Now let's see what it looks like with shielded Ethernet cables. With shielded Ethernet cables, as you can tell right from the jump, there's a lot more going on here. There's this plastic foil that's surrounding the pairs of twisted cable wires. So if we twist this out of the way here you can see in here you still have your 4 pairs of twisted wires, but you have this foil covering it, and on top of that there's this little wire here. This wire is called a drain wire. It's used only in shielded Ethernet cables. We'll talk about what that does later. But as you can see here, opening up the shielded Ethernet cable and comparing it to the unshielded Ethernet cable, they're quite different here. There's a lot more going on with that shielded Ethernet cable. Now that you've seen what these two different types of cables look like, let's talk about why they exist in the first place. Well, these two different types of Ethernet cables exist because they both have to do with protecting the signals that are going through these Ethernet cables from interference. There are 2 main types of interference that we have to worry about. Number 1 is crosstalk, and number 2 is electromagnetic interference, or EMI. Let's start with crosstalk, and in order to do so, we have to go back to the basics. Whenever you have a flow of electricity, it results in a small magnetic field being created. So with Ethernet cables, you have 8 different copper wires, all of them having pulses of electricity being sent through them. So essentially you have 8 different possibilities for a magnetic field being created. The risk here is because these wires are so close together, the electromagnetic field of one of the wires can impact all the other wires that are in the cable. So in order to counteract the effects of crosstalk, that's why these pairs of wires inside the Ethernet cable are twisted together. By twisting the wires, you're reducing the effects of these magnetic fields, and that's why you see that both with shielded and unshielded Ethernet cables. Both of them have wires that are right next to each other, so regardless of any outside factors, there's a possibility for crosstalk in both types of cables. The other source of interference we have to worry about with Ethernet cables is electromagnetic interference. As we talked about, flow of electricity causes a magnetic field that can impact the wires inside an Ethernet cable. So now that we've solved the problem of the different magnetic fields inside the cable itself, what if there are other systems or other things in the environment that are generating larger magnetic fields? This usually happens when you have powerful equipment, heavy machinery, things that require a heavy electrical draw. Those wires will result in a larger magnetic field, which has a greater chance of impacting all the wires that are inside the Ethernet cable. So how do you protect from any outside sources of electromagnetic interference? Well, that's what on the shielded Ethernet cable, that's what this foil and this drain wire are for. The foil and the drain wire are meant to ground this electromagnetic interference so that way it doesn't impact the communications going on inside the cable. So when should you use unshielded versus shielded Ethernet cables? It should be pretty apparent at this point. You need to use shielded Ethernet cables whenever you have a high risk of electromagnetic interference from devices and machines in the environment. With that said, most homes and offices are environments that don't have a lot of electromagnetic interference. So for the vast majority of you out there, you don't need shielded Ethernet cables. And keep in mind, even if you have sources of electromagnetic interference in the environment that you're wiring Ethernet cables, as long as the Ethernet cables are a foot or more away from these sources, you're probably not going to have any problems. So what I'm saying here is you really only use shielded Ethernet cables if you need to put them in walls near alternating current power lines, or there's no other choice but to wire the Ethernet cable right next to these sources of EMI. I know what you're thinking at this point. Why wouldn't I just use shielded Ethernet cables to make sure that my Ethernet cables are protected? Well, the reason for this, and it's actually a pretty good one, is because shielded Ethernet cables provide added complexity to your home network. These Ethernet cables need to be properly grounded in order for them to work. Otherwise, you're better off with an unshielded Ethernet cable because the shielded Ethernet cable won't be doing anything. So if you're connecting two shielded Ethernet cables together with a coupler, you need to make sure that that coupler supports grounding and supports shielded Ethernet cables. Any sort of terminations, they need to make sure that they're supporting shielded Ethernet cables. It just makes things a whole lot more complicated if you might not even need them in the first place. The takeaway here is to use unshielded Ethernet cables by default and only start using shielded Ethernet cables if you absolutely need to and you can't avoid the EMI that's in your environment. If you have any questions about this information, please drop a comment below. If you found this video useful, please give it a like. That way it will get shared with other people and we can ensure they're using the right type of Ethernet cable in their home as well. And lastly, if you like the content that I put out on my channel, I invite you to subscribe. That way you'll get to see when I put out new videos that will have new tips and tricks that will benefit both you and your home network. As always, thanks for watching this episode from Network from Home, and we'll catch you on the next one.